getting this started. Well. Introduce my brother that surprised me by being here today, and his wife Hope. So Wanda Tucker and his wife Hope, and so that was a pleasant surprise. I'm just so honored to be a part of the Jazzy Ladies and to have an opportunity to be here, and want to thank my Margaret Alva and her crew and everybody, and for you all to be out here to celebrate Juneteenth. So my backstory is this. When we grew up, we were told that we were descendants of the first black child born in America. Now, there was so much more to the story, as our cousin, who was our family historian and genealogist, would tell, but she didn't have all the details, but she had lots of pieces of snippets here and there. And as researchers and scholars continued to learn more about the earliest Africans to arrive. And at first they were all in Jamestown, and then they learned later that it was Fort Monroe at Point Comfort that the first ship actually arrived. So over the years, the narrative has changed and become stronger because of research. So we trace our lineage to Angola, Africa, to the Ndongo Kingdom, which is in the province of Melange, and of the Mbandu people. So we trace our lineage there. Our lineage is not a straight line, I have to tell you. We don't have all the details and all of the dates, but with DNA, oral history, and the evidence by scholarship and research and historians, we were able to place our family there. Well, what makes our story so significant is in the 1624-1625 census record. It is documented in the household of Captain William Tucker, Isabel Negro, Anthony Negro, their child baptized William. In the 1624-1625 census record, it is the only family documented in record. Now, was it the only family? Probably not. But it is the only family documented. William was not the only child, but it was the only child by name that was documented with his parents in the household. So some refer to us as the first black family. Well, we are part of that first black family only due to documentation and not because we're the first or the originals. And so the next part of the story is like this. Our ancestors were in the Ndongo Kingdom. They were kidnapped. They were taken to Fort Massagono, and I'm going to tell you another story about that. And then they were in a storehouse into this big ship that carries 350 enslaved. They had enough that they would put on the ship to take across the Atlantic. Well, this ship was the San Juan Bautista. This ship was headed to Veracruz, Mexico. Well, the enslaved had been kidnapped once, but in mid of the Atlantic, they were kidnapped again by pirates. So then they were put on two separate smaller ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer. But this time their destination had changed. They were now going to the English colony, and this is in August of 1619. And then they landed there, and John Rolfe documents 20 and odd Negroes. So that's just a brief story about how they got from the interior of Angola to Virginia, right? But I want to share a particular type of a journey that I believe that they had that is not documented specifically, but because I've done research and pulled from so many different sources, I want you to bear with me as my ancestors made this journey. there among the Mbundu people. It is a regular day. All of a sudden, the people were scurrying. The Mbangala people were coming to kidnap them. They knew why they were there. They were hoping that this time that they were not going to be captured. They were. Among the group of people that were captured, they had to walk from the interior to the coastline, between 70 and 100 miles. Can you envision that with me? Walking barefoot across uneven terrain, chained one to another. The one thing about the slavery industry is it didn't discriminate against age or size or gender or race, sex. It was the little ones, the middle ones, the older adults, because they were all going to be sold and they were all going to be useful on the plantations. It didn't matter. The horror in that part is that the Angolans were used to mining, but the iron they used made tools. Now the iron was made for shackles. And then they had to wear these shackles as they walked across this uneven terrain. If they fell, they were dragged. If they resisted, they were killed. They sat down together, they laid down together, they got up together. Some of them may not have even known each other's names, but together they were in the same predicament together, traveling barefoot 70 to 100 miles across the terrain. Where were they going? They were going to Masangano Fortress. When they arrived there, they were taken to the judicial center. There they were found guilty. Guilty. And you may be wondering, what were they guilty of? They were guilty of being black. They were guilty of being black because the story, the biblical story that was interpreted by the Catholic Church was they were descendants of Cain, and Cain was cursed by God. Now, the fact that they were black and that was the curse is not biblical. However, it is the story that had been passed down to the ages and a story used to justify slavery. So there they were in this judicial system, standing there before these folks who said, "You're black. Your sentence, enslavement, and you will be deported from Angola." They were tried as adults. The littlest one, what were their crimes? They were too innocent to have harmed anyone. The young girls, they hadn't had their period yet. They aren't even in adulthood. The young boys had not had their opportunity to become men yet. And yet they were sentenced as criminals. And they were going to be put on this ship and transferred across the Atlantic to Veracruz, Mexico was their destination. After they were sentenced, they were marched over to this slave garden. They call it a slave garden. I don't know why they call it a slave garden. I haven't figured it out yet why they call it a slave garden. It's up on a hill, it's cobblestones. The fencing around it is about 4-foot high cobblestones also. And there was this cross, this humongous Christian cross that was probably about 50 feet in the air. I believe it was like a lighthouse, so as they were walking across the terrain, that was a guide for the Portuguese and those who had enslaved them to see this is where you need to go. It was like that in my mind. That's where they went. They went to this garden. There was no flowers there. There's no beauty there. There's nothing impressive about that place, except this is the place that the Angolans were going to be branded, baptized, and they were going to be sent off across the Atlantic. Baptized, you might wonder. Why are they going to be baptized? Because most of them were already Christians, because Christianity had already been a part of their culture, part of the tribe. But the Catholic Church wanted to make sure that if they were going across that Atlantic, they were going to make it, and if they didn't make it, their souls were going to be saved, and they could wash their hands and say, we did our job. There's nothing on our conscience. We're not guilty. We did our part. We baptized them, and they're in God's hands now. Can you imagine my ancestors, Isabel and Anthony, standing there on this cobblestone platform, wondering about their destiny, wondering about their future. They didn't have time to pack a suitcase. They did not have time to say, Mom and Dad, I'm going on a trip. I'll see you when I get back. There was no hugs and kisses. There was no going away party. They were snatched from their community, but the one thing they knew was they would never come back again. In the Kimbundu language, the elders still called the waters Kalunga. That means death. And the reason why they did that is because all of the loved ones that were taken on the water never came back. They knew they would never come back. So at the Masingana Fort, once they was baptized and branded, they had to walk down this pathway under the Masingana Fort to get on a boat to go down to the Wanda port before being on the big ship, the San Juan Bautista, and going across the Atlantic. I walked that pathway. Step by step, I walked in the footsteps of Isabel and Anthony. Step by step, I walked in the footsteps of millions of other Angolans that passed that way. Step by step, on this dirt pathway, past the Catholic Church, step by step. The tears ran down my face. I kept holding my head down, and I would remember my ancestors, Isabel and Anthony, were proud people, and I would raise my head up, and I'd walk a little further, step by step. Tears, pain, anger. You see, I knew their destiny. They didn't know theirs. I knew what was going to happen to them. They did not know that. The history that I have today, they didn't know. They had no idea about their future. But lock, stock, and chains and shackles, they walked that pathway. Walking the pathway in the footsteps of my ancestors made their story real in my soul. It was not something that I read in a book anymore. It wasn't a story that somebody else was going to tell me about the enslaved in such a way that they had no humanity, that they were not real persons. They were just enslaved people. But when you start to put a name to them, Isabel and Anthony, they come to life. You can almost see your own relatives in them in some way or another. Step by step. Who gave them the right to enslave them? Who gave them the right to take from them their humanity? Who gave them the right to say that they were criminals, that they were descendants of Cain? Who thought it was an okay thing to rob them from their land, from their people, from their home, and not be concerned about their future and destiny only as property in the hands of someone else? Who gave them the rights? Well, the Catholic Church at that time was very much involved in the slave trade with the Portuguese and the Spanish. The slave trade had been going on for over 100 years, but this time in history was a different moment. On that big enslaver, the San Juan Bautista, Isabel and Antony were among those 350 enslaved. On this ship, shackled, packed like sardines, going across the Atlantic Ocean. Destination, Mexico, Veracruz, Mexico. And as I shared, the ship was pirated. And there were a few taken off and put on the San Juan, the White Lion, and few taken off and put on the Treasurer. And as I shared, they ended up in Hampton, Virginia. I don't know how my ancestors made that journey. I don't know how they survived. Grit, somebody might say, grit. Well, it couldn't have been just grit. But I don't know. Was it the hand of God? I can't answer that question either, because a whole lot of Angolans didn't make the journey. Some died of sickness and were thrown overboard. Some resisted and were killed and thrown overboard. The group of the survivors got smaller and smaller as they got closer and closer to Veracruz, Mexico. What I do know, I can tell you today. 4 centuries, 20 generations, 40 decades later, I am here. I am here because Isabel and Antony survived the journey. I am here because Isabel and Antony adapted. I am here because they learned the language. They learned to work. They learned to survive in this culture, in this country that was not their own. And somewhere 5 years later, they gave birth to this little child, William, that first black child born and baptized in the English colony, of whom we are descendants. Why does this story matter so much, you may ask? Because most African Americans don't know their origin story. Most African Americans don't know where they came from, don't know how they're connected to the motherland. Most don't. When I was in Angola, I met with a Soba, like a storyteller. And when he told the story of the slave trade, and he talked about how the worst thing that happened as a result of all of the young people being taken was the collapse of their economy. The young people were gone. They weren't there to bear children, to keep some generations going. They weren't there to work the crops in the fields and contribute to the community. They weren't there to keep their future in sight and knowing that there was a greater hope beyond them. Taking all of that youth out of their community, and financially the economic decline of them. And it would sadden my heart. But here the stories were passed down from Soba to Soba to Soba. And finally I said to the Soba, what message should I take back to my family in the U.S.? He said, tell them they have relatives here. Step by step, stepping off the plane, stepping along the journey of my ancestors, knowing the paths that they went through, and knowing today that as a survivor of that, as a surviving descendant, I am here to tell part of their story. I was home. I felt called by the ancestors to be here to tell their story. I feel called. I feel honored to be chosen, to be able to tell a little bit of their story, to continue to do the research and fill in the gaps and tell people they were strong, they were resilient, they were a people of faith, they were a people of hope, they were a people that says, I will not die. I will continue to go on. And to prove it, we're going to bear a child. And that's the one child that we do know of, the first child. I'm sure they had many other children, and there are many other Tuckers everywhere. And there's Tuckers, and there's other family members in the U.S. that are connected to our relatives in Angola. This story is important. As you've heard Jay talk about, everybody's got a story. Because no longer are they just some distant image in a book on a slave ship laying side by side in 350. You've seen that image, haven't you? You've seen that image. But when you start to say, that was my loved one on that ship, Isabel and Anthony, that brings them to life as people, real live human beings that struggled and suffered and persevered, and they made it. Am I glad they made it? Absolutely. So that I could be here today and tell you I am an Angolan American. Step by step, I will continue to tell their story. Step by step, I will continue to hold on to hope beyond hope, that we will fill more gaps in and tell more of their story so that they will live on. They will live on through us. From generation to generation, they're no longer lost. They have been found, and we will continue to tell their story. That day, I was home. The William, thank you. The William Tucker 1624 Society was formed. It did not start as a way of preserving this history and story, but it has evolved as an organization. The 1624 Society, we have a cemetery that seats our narrative, which is near Captain William Tucker's plantation. So we're pretty sure that cemetery is connected. We just haven't been able to prove it yet. Still working on that research. And we are starting to do more in telling the story and doing research. We also offer scholarships to students. And we started last year in 2022 an Angola, Tucker Family Angola Heritage Tour. So now we're taking family and friends to Angola to walk those same paths as the Angolans, to see where Queen Nzinga, where she fought some of those battles, to be able to be a part of that history. You know, when I was growing up, I heard that we were descendants of kings and queens. Did you all hear that? Any of you all heard that? Well, when I grew up, that's one of the things I heard. But I didn't know a name of any of those kings and queens. And when I went to Angola, there's a humongous statue there of the queen in her warrior outfit. I am a descendant of that same people, the Mbandu people. Now, I'm not saying I'm a descendant of Queen Nzinga. I'm just saying a descendant of those people. Everybody's got a story. Everybody's got something to share. Make your people and family live again. Tell that story. Regardless of where your story begins or ends, pick it up wherever you are and pass it on. Because what you're passing on is jewels of information, jewels of a story, jewels of people that lived, people who struggled, people who had hope, people who endured more than we could have ever imagined. But we know that they survived because you all are here today. So on behalf of the William Tucker 1624 Society, my family, and the Jazzy Ladies, and for Juneteenth, thank you.